There is a question that most people in the world have never asked. Not because it is unimportant, but because it sounds impossible. A question so unexpected that the first time you hear it, your mind instinctively tries to reject it. Why are Israelis learning the Filipino language? Not tourists, not diplomats, not people preparing for travel, but ordinary Israelis. Children, parents, grandparents, learning Tagalog, speaking it inside their homes, using it in moments of comfort and care. At first, it does not make sense. Israel and the Philippines are separated by thousands of kilometers. Different continents, different histories, different cultures, different languages. They do not share borders. They do not share ancestry. They do not even share the same alphabet. So how could a language born in the islands of Southeast Asia find its way into the daily lives of families in the Middle East? How could Tagalog, a language shaped by oceans, islands, and generations of family life, be spoken in homes surrounded by desert winds and ancient cities? It sounds unbelievable, almost impossible. And yet, it is happening. Quietly, naturally, inside real homes. Not as a trend, not as a performance, but as everyday life. And this raises a deeper question, because languages do not travel this far without a reason. They do not survive in foreign homes without something holding them there. So if Tagalog is being spoken in Israeli homes today, then something powerful must have happened long before the first word was ever spoken. Something history remembers, even when the world forgets. And that is where this story truly begins. Most people think history is made by loud events, wars, speeches, revolutions. But sometimes, the most powerful moments happen quietly, inside rooms where no one is watching. To understand why Tagalog found a home in Israel, we have to go back to a year when the world was still broken. The wounds of World War II were still fresh. Cities were in ruins. Families were grieving. And millions of lives had been changed forever. The Jewish people had just survived one of the darkest chapters in human history. They were displaced, scattered, searching for safety. And the world stood at a crossroads. The United Nations was preparing to vote on the creation of a Jewish state. Many nations hesitated. Some were afraid of conflict. Some feared political consequences. Others chose silence. It was safer not to take a side. But in that room, one small nation made a choice that would echo far beyond that moment. The Philippines voted yes. Not because it was powerful. Not because it would benefit economically. Not because anyone forced them. They voted yes because it was right. Because they understood suffering. Because they had known occupation, loss, and hardship themselves. The Philippines saw a people who had endured unimaginable pain and chose compassion over convenience. That single vote did not make headlines for decades. But it was remembered. Deeply. Because when a nation stands with you in your darkest hour, you do not forget. Israel did not forget. Years passed. Generations changed. But gratitude remained. Quietly stored in memory, waiting for the moment when it could be returned. And that moment would come in a way no one expected. Time moved forward. The world changed. Israel began to grow, to build, to heal. As the years passed, a new challenge emerged. The population was aging. Parents became grandparents. Grandparents needed care. Families wanted help, but not just anyone. They needed people they could trust. People who would treat their loved ones not as work, but as family. Israel looked outward, and their eyes turned toward the Philippines. Not by accident, not by coincidence. There was already a foundation of respect, a memory of kindness that had never faded. Filipinos began arriving quietly, mostly women, carrying small bags, big hopes, and heavy sacrifices. They left behind children, parents, and homes to care for someone else's family. At first, they were simply called caregivers, helpers, workers. But something unexpected happened. They did not just do their jobs. They listened. They stayed patient. They showed warmth. They spoke gently. They cooked with care. They treated the elderly not as a responsibility, but as someone precious. Slowly, walls came down. Trust grew. And inside those homes, a bond began to form. Not written in contracts. Not spoken out loud. But felt. Deeply. This was no longer just about employment. It was about connection. And connection, when it is real, changes everything. As days turned into months, and months into years, something quietly transformed inside those homes. The relationship changed. What began as simple caregiving slowly became something deeper. Filipino caregivers were no longer seen as outsiders. They were there in the mornings, helping someone stand when their legs were weak. They were there in the afternoons, listening to stories that had been told 100 times before and still responding with patience. They were there at night, when loneliness felt heavier than pain, offering comfort through presence alone. They learned routines, favorite meals, small habits. They knew which cup someone preferred, which chair felt safest, which memories made someone smile. And in return, they offered something rare, genuine care, not rushed, not forced, not cold, care that came from the heart. Israeli families began to notice. This wasn't just professionalism. This was devotion. Elderly parents started waiting not just for assistance, but for companionship. Children watched as their grandparents laughed more, felt calmer, felt seen. The word helper slowly lost its meaning. New words took its place. Names spoken with warmth, with familiarity, with love. The caregiver was no longer she. She was our Nana, our Yaya, our family. Inside kitchens, shared meals became normal. Inside living rooms, stories crossed cultures. Laughter filled spaces that had once felt quiet. And without anyone planning it, without any announcement, something remarkable happened. Filipino presence became part of daily life, not as labor, but as belonging. And when you belong somewhere, your culture comes with you. Your habits, your kindness, your way of loving. This was no longer a transaction. It was a relationship. One built slowly, patiently, day by day. And it was only just beginning. And in that quiet belonging, something even deeper began to grow. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It wasn't planned. It happened naturally, in moments no one thought to document. A caregiver humming softly while preparing dinner. A familiar melody drifting through the home. At first, no one questioned it. Then children began to listen. They fell asleep to songs that weren't in Hebrew, but felt just as comforting. Lullabies carried warmth, even when the words were unfamiliar. Soon, those sounds became familiar. Filipino words slipped into daily life without effort. Simple phrases, gentle expressions, words spoken during care, during comfort, during love. And because these moments happened during the most human times, when someone was sick, tired, or vulnerable, the words stayed. They attached themselves to emotion, to safety, to kindness, to trust. Children learned them first, not from books, not from lessons, but from the people who held their hands, wiped their tears, and stayed beside them when parents were busy. A child didn't ask what language it was. They only knew it meant comfort. And slowly, those words became part of the home, not replacing Hebrew, standing beside it. Two languages existing together, because two kinds of love existed together. This was the moment everything changed. Because when a language becomes the language of care, it stops being foreign. It becomes family. And in homes across Israel, without announcements or headlines, Tagalog quietly found a place where it would stay. This was no longer just history. This was the beginning of something living, something shared, something that would be passed on. Years passed, and what began quietly started to reshape entire households. Filipino caregivers were no longer just present in the background. They became constants. They were there during birthdays, during holidays, during moments of grief and celebration. They learned Jewish traditions, the rhythm of Shabbat, the meaning behind prayers and rituals. And at the same time, they shared pieces of themselves, not by teaching, but by living. They cooked dishes that smelled like home, rice steaming gently on the stove, adobo simmering slowly, filling the air with something unfamiliar, yet comforting. Curious family members tasted it, then asked for it again. What was once different became familiar. What was once foreign became loved. Caregivers spoke Tagalog to each other, softly, casually. Children listened. They picked up sounds before they understood meaning. Words became games. Phrases became jokes. Accents became endearing. Parents noticed something strange. Their children responded to Tagalog as naturally as they did to Hebrew. Not because they were taught, but because they were surrounded by it. In moments of care, language leaves the deepest imprint. When a caregiver says, "Okay lang," while calming a crying child, the words stay. When someone whispers "tulog na" at bedtime, the comfort remains. Language tied to emotion becomes permanent. Israeli families slowly realized they weren't just hiring help. They were raising children in two emotional languages. One spoken by blood, one spoken by love. And love, when repeated every day, becomes tradition. This wasn't planned multiculturalism. This was human connection doing what it does best: blending lives, blending hearts, and reshaping identity without anyone noticing until it was already done. Then something even more unexpected began to happen, quietly and without anyone planning it. The language did not stay in the background. It did not remain something only caregivers spoke among themselves. It moved naturally into the lives of the children. At first, it appeared in small moments. A child repeating a word they didn't realize they had learned. A phrase spoken casually, without thinking, without translation. Parents would pause, surprised, wondering where it came from. And the truth was, it didn't come from one lesson or one conversation. It came from repetition, from comfort, from care. Language learned during moments of safety does not feel foreign. It feels familiar. Children began responding to Tagalog as naturally as they responded to Hebrew, not because one replaced the other, but because both existed side by side. Two sounds, two rhythms, one home. And with language came attachment. Deep emotional bonds formed between children and the people who cared for them every day. These caregivers were not background figures. They were constants. Voices that meant reassurance. Faces that meant stability. When a child was tired, scared, or unwell, the words spoken to them mattered. And those words stayed. That is how Tagalog took root. Not through classrooms or formal lessons, but through moments that shape memory. Through bedtime. Through comfort. Through everyday care. As these children grew older, they carried those words with them into school, into friendships, into the world outside their homes. Sometimes spoken proudly. Sometimes spoken casually. Always spoken naturally. When others asked how they knew the language, the answer was simple. It was spoken at home. And that sentence meant everything, because home is where identity is formed. Over time, parents noticed something else. Their children were more open, more empathetic, more curious about cultures beyond their own. Not because they were taught tolerance, but because they lived it daily. They saw respect practiced. They saw kindness modeled. They saw care given without condition. Language became the bridge, connecting generations, cultures, and worlds. What began as help slowly became heritage. What began as necessity became connection. And without headlines or announcements, a generation was growing up fluent not just in words, but in understanding. This was no longer only about caregivers. It was about children who would carry this bond forward into the future, into families of their own. And the story was still unfolding. And now, when we look at the full picture, the meaning becomes clear. This was never just about language. It was about gratitude that never faded, about kindness that was remembered, about love that was returned in the most human way possible. When Israelis learn Filipino, they are not doing it to impress. They are not doing it out of obligation. They are doing it because the language lives in their homes, because it reminds them of care, of patience, of warmth given without condition. It lives in memories of meals shared, of songs sung softly at night, of hands that helped without asking for anything in return. When an Israeli father speaks a Filipino phrase, it is not perfect pronunciation that matters. It is intention. When a child understands Tagalog, it is not confusion. It is connection. Two cultures standing side by side, not competing, not replacing one another, but respecting each other. This bond was not built by governments, not by speeches, not by treaties. It was built quietly, inside homes, inside families, inside moments no one thought to record. Filipinos did not arrive carrying power. They arrived carrying care. They gave their time, their patience, their hearts, and in return, they were honored not just with thanks, but with understanding, with language learned, with culture respected, with love returned. In a world that often feels divided, This story reminds us of something simple and true, that humanity travels faster than borders, that love speaks louder than politics, that language, when carried by care, becomes a bridge no conflict can destroy. And so the story of Israelis learning Filipino is not about who learned whose language. It is about what happens when people choose kindness, remember gratitude, and allow love to shape the future. A quiet story, a powerful one, still being written.